Good evening, everybody. We are going to start. It's 6 o'clock on my side. I hope you guys are doing very well. I am dialing in from a very, very cold, windy Port Elizabeth. It's absolutely freezing, powerful winds, weird, squally rain occasionally. So it's nice and cold, perhaps the right kind of climate actually for the work we're going to be covering this evening, which will begin us with Learning Unit 2. We'll get us started on Learning Unit 2, the work of Angela Carter. And the way I see it, the way I see your work, is that it is basically fairy tales for adults. And I'll explain what I mean by that pretty soon. I hope you guys are doing okay, that you've been keeping up with the work. Today is also the day I hope that you were able to hand in your ICE tasks. I'm not going to cover that today in class. I've still got to look at all of them once the work is in. Just a reminder that it's still open on the blog. You can go submit your work. I am going to ask for your ICE tasks only at the end of the semester. So I'm going to leave them all open for you to do throughout the course of the semester. And I think I have to get the ICE marks in by about mid-October. So just make sure you've done 4 ICE tasks by then, and I'll be happy. I'm still going to give you the other 3. I just got to work out exactly which ones I would like you guys to do for me. You also have your assignment coming up, which is called Part 1. It's due on the 9th of September. I think that's right. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the 9th of September. I'm going to do a short, like maybe 10-minute video where I break down the assignment, just going over what I expect to see, what you can do with it, unpacking a few of the terms that might be confusing or technical and that you might not immediately know the meaning of. So look out for that video. I'll post it sometime around the 28th of August. That's when I would like to do it by. If you have any questions about the assignment now, you can ask, just pop them in the chat and I'll probably get around to them by the end of class. Or if you have any questions after class, just send me an email or message me via VC Learn, and I'll try to get back to you as quickly as I can. Okay, shall we start? Just want to check that my sound is okay. You guys can hear me. All good on your side. Hopefully I haven't been speaking into a void for the last 2 minutes. But I want to get us cracking here with Learning Unit 2, Fairy Tales for Adults. We are done with a different kind of fairy tale. If you watched my the last recording I did for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I kind of showed you how that movie is a sort of a modern day fairy tale of its own kind. So you can see how these 2 learning units are linked, is that we are looking at how fairy tales work in our society, but not necessarily the old-fashioned type of fairy tale, but rather the fairy tales for a modern audience, for a grown-up, developed adult audience who are perhaps somewhat out of touch with fairy tales, right? So you would have done, of course, fairy tales in first semester, studied it formally as a genre, looking at where they come from, what they mean, how they operate, and you would have looked at a few like Little Red Riding Hood or Snow White or Cinderella. And I didn't take you for that module, but I have taught that part of it before to other students. And usually the way I teach it to them is that these are fairy tales are very old stories. They go back, you can trace their origins back like, 1,000 years in some cases. They're very old, and yet they still exist today. They exist in our time because they've been carried down through the generations. The only reason you would carry something down through generations like that is because it's valuable, because it has something to it that is more than just an entertainment. A fairy tale is also something that is useful. It's got some sort of a purpose beyond just being a means to put children to bed at night, or turning into a movie or a nursery rhyme or something like that. A story like Snow White, which is very old, has a long history and can be traced all the way back to the early European civilization. that story persists through time because it seems to teach people something. It has an instructive value. We often say fairy tales have a moral in them or a lesson, and that's certainly true. It's a way of, in a way, teaching children, usually, and children usually are the audience for fairy tales, but not necessarily all the time. But they are the vehicles through which we pass knowledge on to children and give them cautionary tales or our morals, what it is that we think is good behavior or bad behavior, how to behave in a way that helps you to survive, or behaving in a way that could get you into trouble one day, actual existential trouble, like partaking in behavior that is life threatening, making bad decisions. What does a bad decision look like? What does a good person look like? How does a bad person behave? And kind of inviting children into this slightly more grown up world in which reality exists, the reality of evil, the reality of badness, of darkness, that there are things out there in the world that want to get you, that want to kill you. And that can be quite shocking for a child to learn about, um, especially when it comes to things like death and violence, but couched in the narrative of a fantastical fairy tale involving dwarves and handsome princes and damsels in distress. Those very dark ideas, those dangerous, tough to grasp ideas, become safer. And so they are passed on to children who learn, who gain wisdom about how the world works. And for a very long time, we didn't have, human civilization did not have mass schooling and mass education like we do today. Most people didn't go to school for generations, for thousands of years. People did not go to school. Their education came from something else, a different source, which is community knowledge that gets passed on from one generation to a next, usually through an oral tradition. So saying the story out loud around a campfire, in a house, in some sort of a setting with a community of elders, middle and youngsters who share in the development and passing down of stories. And it isn't until the 17 and 1800s till these fairy tales are formally written down in a kind of quote unquote final version. Oral stories can change. Written down stories that are published and put out around the world tend to remain the same because they get republished and they become, in a way, sacred. So the fairy tales as we know them today, and the ones you studied with the Grimm brothers, and those fairy tales are kind of the ones that have remained as they are. They've been turned into movies and all sorts of other things too, but I'm sure you learned about that last semester. But that's basically what I wanted to communicate there, was this idea that fairy stories, fairy tales are kind of a valuable form of knowledge or wisdom that we pass down through the generations in the form of stories or allegories or metaphors that get the most important ideas of our culture or civilization into the next generation. And fairy tales are very, very effective and efficient and also economical, like easy way to get complicated ideas down to the next cohort in our civilization. Okay, so what is the Bloody Chamber then? And why are we studying this as a fairy tale? What the heck is the Bloody Chamber? It is a collection of short stories written by Angela Carter in the 1970s and published in the year 1979. So as a collection of short stories, I think I just want to explain to you in case you're not familiar with it, but this is not a novel we're studying, but rather kind of like a collection of fairy tales or tales that she's written for a modern audience, but they're also what we would call formally a short story. We wouldn't necessarily call these fairy tales or tales, but rather I'm going to call them short stories because they're kind of written for a modern audience, and they are not always short. Some are quite long, but they are shortish narratives that are kind of obey the laws of modern narrative structure and are certainly targeted at a modern audience. There's all kinds of, I think there are 10 stories in it altogether. You don't have to know all 10. The prescribed stories are 6. They are these ones list. You'll find this on VC Learn under the Learning Unit 2, the first page of Learning Unit 2. These selected short stories are The Bloody Chamber, Puss in Boots, The Snow Child, The Lady of the House of Love, The Company of Wolves, and Wolf Alice. And we are in these classes, we are going to do 3 of those stories. We are going to do The Snow Child, then we'll do The Company of Wolves in the next class. And then in another class, we'll do, to finish off, we'll do The Bloody Chamber. The other 3 are going to be self-study. So you've got to make sure you read those yourself. But the 3 that I've picked, I think, really capture extremely well what it is that Angela Carter is trying to do, because she has a very clear purpose in this collection of short stories. It's not that she's doing the same thing over and over again, but she is working with the same intention and purpose and trying to find a variation on a certain idea that she would like to express or capture. What that idea is, we'll come to over the course of these next few weeks as we look at her short stories. So make sure you've got the texts in whatever form. These are the 6 you've got to know. These are the 6 you can be examined on anyway. But the 3 we'll do again are Snow Child, Company of Wolves, and The Bloody Chamber. You'll notice that these stories differ in length quite a lot. Snow Child is very short. It's not even 500 words long. Company of Wolves is 10 pages, which is the usual length of a short story, while The Bloody Chamber is quite a lot longer. It's about 42, 41 pages long. And it's also the title story of the collection. So that's an indication to you that that story, not only does it start the collection, but it also gives the collection its name, its title. So there's something about that story that Carter herself saw as really capturing and embodying everything that her writing is about, everything she values in her writing. I don't know if you've read Angela Carter before. I'm not quite sure if she's like all that fashionable or well known. She's written a whole bunch of other stuff too. She's a very versatile writer. She writes in different genres. So she writes kind of modern day fairy tales. She also writes science fiction, fantasy stuff. She also wrote a book called The Nights at the Circus, which is a novel about kind of circus people. Just double check, we don't do an exam, right, as a POE. Yeah, when I say exam or be examined on, I just mean you do a POE. That's what I mean. Yeah, correct. So but they can, in the POE, they could ask you stuff about any of these texts. So you've got to have a familiarity with them. So Carter's very versatile writer. She wrote a lot. She died sadly quite young. She was only 50 or 51 years old when she passed away. So, but she left behind a large body of work, and you should investigate it, look it up, check it out. They've made some movies about her books too. She is as we're going to see, she's a very, very dark and twisted writer. So if you have a taste for the macabre, for the horrible, for the unsettling, for the disturbing, the distressing, this is definitely a writer for you. If not, I just thought I should put a bit of a warning label on this, because if you haven't read her yet, she has, like I said, she is quite a twisted writer. She's funny, she's entertaining, she's very good, she's a brilliant writer. The way she uses language and especially imagery is very provocative and interesting. But she doesn't hold back, and she will say and write things that you can regard as being offensive, disturbing, even disgusting and gross, and in a way unnecessary. Why does she have to go that far with some of the things she decides to do? And that's totally fair. When I teach this stuff to the first years in my physical class, these are like 19, 20-year-olds, and they are quite horrified that somebody would write such gruesome stories. Maybe that's the word, is gruesome. But at the same time, I know young people also have a taste for the gruesome and the violent and the dark and the disturbing. She's no more disturbing than anything you would see on like a Netflix TV show that is made for adults, right? She deals quite a lot with like a lot of sexual stuff, so look out for that. But she does it for a reason. She's not doing it actually to shock us. I think she's doing it so that she can provoke us, so that she can unsettle us. And it's in being unsettled that she wants to make us think, that she wants to make us rethink actually what we take for granted. She's doing it to get under our skin, to just break through our conscious minds and start digging around in our unconscious minds. She is, yes, disturbing to read. And you got to remember this was published in 1979. We live now in the year 2024, where our social norms and mores are much different to how life was in the 70s and 80s. So for her to write these stories back then was pretty shocking and very provocative. It was not in fashion to see the world the way Angela Carter sees the world in her stories. Okay. For one thing, and this is something that kind of came up in my classes, is that the way she writes, sometimes, not always, just a few times, is almost, and she even says this in her stories itself sometimes, that her stories kind of come across as a little bit pornographic. Okay. And the thing that's amazing about our world now is that, okay, in 1979, to be blunt, if you wanted to find pornography, it was really difficult. You had to like go to a weird shop, and in full view of the public, go into these sort of adult shops and whatever, and it was just hard to get. It was hard, and kind of you didn't want to be embarrassed and humiliated by going into one. So it was hard to find pornography back then. These days, it's hard to avoid it. It feels like it's just everywhere. You can find it so easily on social media, on the internet. It's all free. A lot of what you see on television or in movies is not explicitly pornographic, but it has the kind of almost the visual look of it sometimes, right? So we live in a very different world to the one Carter lived in, and yet still these stories are quite disturbing and provocative. Okay, they're also retellings of fairy tales. So here we have a strange mix, first of all, right? This oppositional thing where she's taking fairy tales, a genre of stories ostensibly for children, and she's turning them into something for adults using extremely explicit, disturbing content. So she's taking something designed for kids and turning it into something for adults and doing it in a very strange, counterintuitive way. So think about that for just a second, what that means. Why would she do that? In one way, yeah, she's probably doing it because she wants to get your attention. But there's a deeper meaning, like I was saying a bit earlier, which is that she wants to get under your skin. And in doing so, by getting under your skin, she's also forcing you to reflect on why it is that you're having such a visceral response to her work. By visceral, I mean like a physical response to her work, where you almost disgusted or you grossed out or you can't believe what it is that she just said or did. It's so weird and strange. Why would she do that? And then you kind of step back a bit and you think, well, why did I have that response to the text? Where does my response come from? What is it about me that is thinking that way? And that's what she's up to, is that she's provoking you. She's making you rethink. She has described her intention with the fairy tales not to just kind of retell the stories. She's not doing versions of them. She's not like a cover band musical artist. She's not just retelling the straight story of the fairy tale in a cool way, or to do adult fairy tales as such, but rather her intention, as she has said, is that she wanted to extract something from the fairy tales and put it on display, remade afresh. And what that thing is, she said, is that she wanted to take out their latent content and make their latent content the subject of the story. Okay, now what does latent mean? What does she mean when she says latent? This might be a word you've come across in some context before, possibly even in psychology. If you do like Sigmund Freud in psychology, I don't know if you do or if you will, but he uses the word latent quite a lot. But basically, what latent means is something that is hidden or can't be seen. It's expressed, it's buried, it's present, but it's invisible. It's something unsaid or indirect. It could also mean maybe subtextual, something you read between the lines in a story. So what Carter is saying is that there is the meaning she's writing about in these fairy tales is actually present in the originals, but it's a meaning that you've got to read between the lines for. It's subtextual, it's buried away and unsaid. And what she is doing is just telling the truth of the stories. She's actually saying what they're truly about. Okay, so she's saying that there's something hidden in the fairy tales and that she is bringing it out and making it the explicit subject of her stories. Okay, so the latent, the hidden thing, different words can be used for that. Maybe even like if you want to think about it in a personal way, as people who are studying psychology or probably quite interested in it, we all have latent selves. We have a subconscious or unconscious mind. So said Sigmund Freud and other psychologists too. We have a conscious mind, the thing that gets us through the day. It remembers what our name is. It reminds us to put pants on in the morning. Um, does our work for us, makes the sandwiches, thinks thoughts, and so on. The conscious mind does that, but there's a second level, a deeper layer of the unconscious mind, which, according to some psychologists, is your true self. It's the real you that's busy working away in the shadows. You can't see it. You can't really call it into existence on demand. It will turn up in your dreams, and it will turn up in your desires and your passions and your true goals or your true wants or what you feel is your true self. And that's a strange paradox, because how can your true self be something you don't even know? Okay, so it's a very, very abstract philosophical question, and it presents a kind of problem for human life and for psychology. How do you bring out the true self of another person or yourself if by its very nature it can't be grasped, and it's not meant to be fully grasped? It's only meant to be seen at a glance or by fortune or by teasing it out in your behaviors and trying to analyze what it is that you really want to do. Okay, that's what Carter's playing with in the fairy tales, is that she's saying that underneath the surface of a fairy tale lies a whole churning tumult of horrible, awful, enchanting, amazing, shocking, surprising ideas and themes that are just below the surface. And all you got to do is kind of fish them out and put them on display and show the audience what exactly the fairy tales are saying all along, but which you just couldn't see because you weren't paying the right kind of attention. So that's one way to see what she's doing. And that's maybe also kind of a healthy way to live your own life, which is that you've got to listen for your subconscious. You've got to acknowledge it. You've got to give it what it wants. You've got to feed it every so often with something. Because if you don't, if you shut it down, if you ignore it, it actually grows angry and it turns into a neurotic monster that starts to control your life without you knowing it. And you find yourself making all kinds of terrible decisions involuntarily. That usually means you are not doing well by your subconscious mind, and it's trying to get your attention. So you've got to feed it things, or you've got to acknowledge it. There's another famous psychologist called Carl Jung, and he said that we have a shadow self, and you've got to acknowledge your shadow and let it come out every so often in order to keep it pleased. So she's kind of doing the same thing, which is we've got to acknowledge all the horrible, awful, disgusting things that are possible in the world, because if we acknowledge that they're real, we know how to deal with them. Okay, I think she also plays around a lot with opposites. She brings out themes and ideas that seem to oppose actually the accepted meaning of the original, quote unquote, original fairy tale. So a lot of what she works with is stuff that you think actually doesn't belong in a fairy tale, but she's saying it does. And she also then fuses together these oppositional things, like things you don't think belong together do find a natural fusing in her stories, like love and violence go together, jealousy but acceptance goes together, gentleness and abuse, um, pleasure and pain. She takes these things that are opposites and she finds a way to bring them together in a shocking and very surprising way. Okay, just a reminder that a lot of this also has to do with your study of the canon last semester. I would say that Angela Carter is one of the writers who allows us to rethink the meaning of the canon. Okay, so here we have a rethinking of popular texts or a text that is important to our culture for some reason. And she's kind of re-looking at things we take for granted. We take fairy tales for granted. They are what they are. They're for kids. They have a unified, stable meaning and purpose, and that is that. They're in the canon. They've calcified into their position in the world, and that's it. What she's doing is kind of breathing new life into these old ideas and saying, actually, they're more vital than you think they are. They're more alive. They're more strange than you are willing to grant. And she kind of just gives herself permission to break all the rules and say, I'm going to dismantle these fairy tales, and I'm going to see what's really hidden under the hood, and I'm going to show you that what has been there all along is actually something that's been invisible to you, but which you must know in order to live in a changing modern world. So she's taking something old, making it new again, just like Tarantino does in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. He's taking this old idea of something like a Western and breathing new life in it to give it a new purpose, to create something for a culture, like a broader culture, a civilization, a people, a group, to give this old thing a new purpose for a world that demands new approaches. Okay, and just this is also something that I would teach in the first semester of this module, which is you've got to understand fairy tales are like folklore, right? Um, Folk being a people, a nation, a community bound together by an ethnicity or a culture, right? Folk. And then lore comes from a word meaning instruction and later also would mean knowledge, right? So folklore literally just means the knowledge of the community or national instruction, the knowledge of the people. Well, the knowledge of the people also became a means for teaching and education of the younger people, right? I came across a quote the other day. Somebody said that every generation is invaded by barbarians. We just call them children. In other words, children are barbarians, and we have to civilize them somehow. We have to teach them. We have to turn them into functioning members of our society. Because if we don't, they'll mess everything up and we will lose our civilization. And one way of civilizing children is through stories, narratives, allegories, metaphors, because they carry something important. So fairy tales are how we carry and pass down the wisdom of the group. So now put that together with what I've just been telling you about Angela Carter, that she is taking this wisdom of the group and saying, no, no, actually, there's another way to see this. So she's kind of messing around with something really sacred, something really important. She's messing around with the very vehicle that we use to communicate everything we hold dear. Everything we think is important is contained in these stories in some way, and I'm going to mess around with them. I'm going to, as she said, she's not going to just retell them straight. She's not going to put, I don't know, Little Red Riding Hood in a corporate office job or something. She's going to work with even stranger and weirder metaphors in order to create a new narrative that fits with the demands of the modern world. So if she wants to rewrite these things for modern society, then what kind of things do you imagine she'll do in these quote unquote new stories? What will she be allowed to say that the old fashioned stuff was not allowed to, but which, according to her, might have sort of been there all along? And she's kind of, in a way, innocently just bringing it all out for us to re-enjoy all over again. Okay, so in my research on Carter, this idea pops up a lot. She said it herself. You can find interviews with her online, lots of articles about her, and pretty much everyone who studied her work, as well as Carter herself, will say that what she is up to in these reworked fairy tales is to examine, to think about, to redefine, to play around with this idea of what female power is. Okay, female power. Usually, women in fairy tales are quite weak. They're often the damsels in distress. They are poisoned or treated miserably, and usually have to be rescued from their terrible situation by male power, by a man, a prince, a king, a duke, an earl, whatever. Oftentimes, the women are put into peril by men. So male energy is also kind of negatively coded. But usually, women in fairy tales are kind of victims. They are just passive. They are put in danger and left to suffer. Or they're evil. They're bad, like the evil stepmother figure is kind of a popular thing, and that certainly is in the story we're looking at today, which is the Snow Child. So women kind of come off pretty badly in fairy tales, I think it's fair to say, and men do not. So you can see fairy tales as being of their time, of course, and kind of very deeply encoding ideas of patriarchal power, and patriarchal power as being good, as being normative, as the way things are meant to be, right? Men are protectors, saviors, and women are not. In Carter stories, it's the reverse. And she often uses femininity in some way, ideas around femininity, femaleness, female energy, or tropes, stereotypes, to show that women are only imperiled, put in danger by their own choice, not because they're inherently weak, not because they are weak, but because they think they're weak when they are in fact not. When they make the choice to no longer be passive and instead kind of fight back, enact a sort of feminine backlash against the male energy in the stories, then they are triumphant. Then they win and they save themselves and they get what they want. And in this way, Carter actually kind of rethinks the structure of the fairy tale. And you could say, if you want to, that this is a kind of a feminist approach to fairy tales. There's a certain kind of strong, powerful feminism that comes through in her stories. If you just consider some of the things that happen in her stories, this gives you a little bit of evidence for what I'm saying. One of the stories we'll look at, The Bloody Chamber. You have a 17-year-old girl who marries a very wealthy and much older man. Throughout the story, she sees herself as a kind of stereotypical perfect woman or perfect girl. She's always looking at herself in mirrors, and she's very attractive in a conventional way. But there's also this sense of that when you read the story as well as all of the others, that she has more power than she thinks she does. And that's characteristic of pretty much all these stories, that all the female characters in Carter stories are given a means to save themselves, to escape, to dominate men, or to get from men something they want. Like in this story, for example, she sees that she is highly desired by men, by her husband, her new husband in this case, and she is able to manipulate that desire. She's able to get a kind of power over men that men do not have over women, right? A male has power over women through physicality, but a woman has a different kind of power over a man, and it's more powerful perhaps, and it can be used in ways that suit the woman more than the man. So Carter's kind of saying something quite transgressive there, I think is the word. Transgression is a big part of her stories. Transgression means kind of going against the rules, saying something perhaps you shouldn't, something inappropriate, something shocking, something rude, something that has a bit of a charge of wrong. It's like, it's wrong, it's immoral what she said. And you can make that argument for sure. But there's also a sense of like powerful assertion of a woman breaking out of a constricting idea, story, or version of things, and instead making it her own by being assertive, by being decisive, about knowing what she wants. She's able to get it. In the course of getting it, she often will, the female characters in Carter stories will turn the tables on men, will dominate men, will destroy them sometimes, or get something from the man that is not stereotypically something women want. But in Carter stories, it is. And to be blunt about it, what she's basically saying is that women are sexual beings as well. They enjoy and want sex in the same way that men do, slightly differently, yeah. But to say that again in like the year 1979 during the sort of second or third-ish wave of feminism was something that was quite transgressive. It was not something that was widely said or believed or enacted. So she's kind of really, Carter's a person, a writer who was really at the kind of cutting edge of culture. Somebody who was saying all the things that had not been said yet. Maybe there were things people were thinking or were half formed in the minds of the culture, but Carter was kind of pushing against the very edge of what it is polite to say and what it is polite to write about. And the way she gets there is by, as often as she can, by subverting your expectations, by subverting whatever you think of is normal. You know, what is normal to say and think about a marriage, for example? Well, Carter will shock you with some other take on it. Another example is like in The Company of Wolves, which is what another story we'll look at, is a redoing of Little Red Riding Hood, except in this one, Little Red Riding Hood actually becomes the kind of predatory, dangerous threat to the wolf. Instead of the wolf being a threat to Little Red Riding Hood, it's Little Red Riding Hood who, in a way, domesticates or tames the wolf through her own physical desires, basically, which again is not a very typical, quote unquote, typical female way of doing things. But here she imbues the femininity with almost a kind of masculinity, combining these opposites again, the feminine with the masculine, putting them together in giving you something new, something shocking, something that really makes you think or rethink what it is that you know about the world. And again, a reminder that she's working within fairy tales. So she's making a very bold assertion, which is that these stories contain the new wisdom for the new world. Okay, the old stories are old. They're dead. They're gone. And I'm giving you the new community knowledge. I'm giving you the stuff you need to know now. That's a very bold assertion. It's very ambitious. Um, and that itself, just that, doing that, again, was very unusual for the time, because usually that sort of thing was reserved for male writers. It was male writers who made that claim, not female writers. Male writers usually would be allowed to kind of write, or expected to write, about adventures and big, long stories about brave, heroic other men. And women would write about small little stories about domesticity and raising children and that sort of thing, that kind of nice little thing. Here, Carter is saying, no, no, I'm going to write about whatever I want. I'm going to break all the rules, and I'm going to make a very, very ambitious project out of this, the most ambitious you can get, which is to say that I'm writing stories that are culturally important, and which I think will guide the whole culture. So that's very ambitious of her, and she very much lived the message she was preaching in her stories, insofar as she was preaching anything. And just one more reminder is that if you go onto my YouTube channel, and I've shared this link with you too, I've put the 3 audio versions of the stories we're going to cover in my playlist, so you can actually listen to them as opposed to reading them. Some of them are pretty good readings, actually. So if you're washing the dishes or something, you can put one on and you'll have read one of the stories in no time at all. As you do read them, I want you to look out for the following touch points, just the important themes that she's going to be looking at. One is power balances and how they shift around. By power balances, I mean basically who holds the upper hand over the course of the stories. By upper hand, I mean who has the kind of the dominant position over another person in the story. Fairy tales are set up to be about power imbalances. You know, the damsel in distress who is a victim of the evil stepmother, for example, or is a victim of Bluebeard, a terrible serial killer, something like that. So fairy tales are set up to be about good versus evil. But who in the story is good and who is evil? Who holds the upper hand at the beginning versus who holds it at the end? Carter will very often do this thing where the beginning of the story, the woman, the girl, is on the back foot, is weak, is in danger, but by the end of the story, she is in a position of great power. She's vanquished the man, she's defeated the man, or she's reconciled with the man in a way that the woman ends up being slightly better off than him. How she does that is interesting. It's like very often about this development of the female from innocence to adulthood, and how in order to get from innocence to adulthood, from innocence to experience, you actually have to do bad things. You have to be kind of corrupt. You have to be violent, and you have to indulge those passions which society tells you are bad in order to go from being a child to an adult. And a functioning, secure, healthy adult means you've got to go through this period of inflicting violence, pain, and suffering on other people. Oftentimes, people you know or even love. Okay, that's kind of a hardcore message to take in. You know, why does she do that again? It's because she kind of wants to shock you into thinking interesting ideas. Other things are like desire, sexuality, violence, subversion, transgression. All this stuff will be coming out in her stories. I think it's important to notice that, to note, or just to say, and also for yourself to think about, is that Carter's, as I've said, she's very clear about what she wants to do. She's very clear in how she does it. These are her ideas. You don't have to think that her ideas are good. You don't have to think that her ideas are correct. In teaching the work and in reading them the way that I do, I myself don't necessarily endorse everything she has to say. I'm just trying to work out what it is that she's doing. I think what she's doing is interesting and invaluable. You don't have to agree with her. You don't have to like her work. You just have to, you know, for the purposes obviously of the module and your degree, you have to be as familiar as you can with her work. but also just for the purposes of your own life experience. These are interesting ideas to play around with, and they are ultimately just ideas. They're, they're as harmless as vapor in the air. They're just ideas, and if you kind of think about them, ponder them, reflect on them, it kind of gives you an interesting new perspective on fairy tales, but also your own life and the things you do or want to do or like or don't like. And just that act of reflecting on it like that is, I think, why Carter is such a good writer, because not all writers can make you reflect on yourself psychologically the way she does. Okay. Um, I am going to play a YouTube video. Hopefully it works. So it's like a 2-minute version of The Snow Child. This is her retelling of Snow White. I'm going to go ahead and assume you are familiar with Snow White, the story. You know, Snow White, beautiful young woman, has an evil stepmother. Then mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Not you anymore, stepmother, but rather your stepdaughter, Snow White. She's the fairest of them all. This enrages the mother, who tries to kill Snow White, but Snow White just ends up living with a whole bunch of dwarves. Um, and then the fairy godmother, sorry, the stepmother finds out about it and tries like 3 different ways to kill Snow White. I think she tries to, I can only remember 2 of them, but she gives her a poisoned comb, which gets stuck in her hair, and the dwarves kind of help get it out, so she survives. But then the 3rd time, she's successful by tricking her into eating a poisoned apple, and the apple is, one half of it is red and the other half of it is white, and she bites the red part of the apple, and it poisons her, and she dies. And the dwarves put it in a glass casket, which is just a super creepy idea. All of this stuff, by the way, so they put it in a glass casket, and then one day a prince discovers her lying dead in there, falls in love with her even though she's dead. And according to whichever version of it you read, he takes her body and he carries it, or he takes her casket and he carries it around with him all over the place. Again, a very strange idea. Until one day he bumps the casket in just the right way and it dislodges the apple, the bit of the apple that was stuck in Snow White's throat, and it dislodges it. Then she coughs it up and she comes alive, and she falls immediately in love with the handsome prince. They get married. Mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all? Snow White is the fairest of them all. Oh dear, she's still alive. Evil stepmother tracks her down on her wedding day to the prince. She's caught out though this time, and the handsome prince forces her to wear a pair of red hot shoes and makes her dance in the red hot shoes until she dies. End of story, happily ever after. Got lots of gruesome stuff in there just on its own, right? A very bizarre story when you actually think about it. It's also one of the longer fairy tales. Took me a while just to get through the basics of it. I don't know whatever happened to the dwarves though after Snow White got married. I don't know. It doesn't matter. But it's also one of the longer stories. What Carter does here is she turns it into one of her shortest stories in the collection. It's just a few hundred words long, and as we'll listen to here now on YouTube, it only takes just a few minutes to get through. It then gives you a good flavor of the story. I've just got to bring it up here. And then I'll spend just a little bit of time talking about it too, not too long, because it's also the kind of thing you got to think about. Okay, so I'm going to show you this on my screen, this one, and I'm going to play it. Here we go.
And enjoy our first glittering tale, The Snow Child. Midwinter, invincible, immaculate. The Count and his wife go riding, he on a grey mare, and she on a black one, she wrapped in the glittering pelts of black foxes, and she wore high, black, shining boots with scarlet heels and spurs. Fresh snow fell on snow already fallen. When it ceased, the whole world was white. I wish I had a girl as white as snow, says the Count. They ride on. They come to a hole in the snow. This hole is filled with blood. He says, I wish I had a girl as red as blood. So they ride on again. Here is a raven, perched on a bare bough. I wish I had a girl as black as that bird's feather. As soon as he completed her description, there she stood, beside the road, white skin, red mouth, black hair, and stark naked. She was the child of his desire, and the Countess hated her. The Count lifted her up and sat her in front of him on his saddle, but the Countess had only one thought: how shall I be rid of her? The Countess dropped her glove in the snow and told the girl to get down to look for it. She meant to gallop off and leave her there, but the Count said, I'll buy you new gloves. At that, the fur sprang off the Countess's shoulders and twined round the naked girl. Then the Countess threw her diamond brooch through the ice of a frozen pond. Dive in and fetch it for me, she said. She thought the girl would drown. But the Count said, Is she a fish to swim in such cold water? Then her boots leapt off the Countess's feet and onto the girl's legs. Now the Countess was bare as a bone, and the girl furred and booted. The Count felt very sorry for his wife. They came to a bush of roses, all in flower. Pick me one, said the Countess to the girl. I can't deny you that, said the Count. So the girl picks a rose, pricks her finger on the thorn, bleeds, screams, falls. Weeping, the Count got off his horse, unfastened his breeches, and thrust his virile member into the dead girl. The Countess reined in her stamping mare and watched him narrowly. He was soon finished. Then the girl began to melt. Soon there was nothing left of her but a feather a bird might have dropped, a bloodstain like the trace of a fox's kill on the snow, and the rose she had pulled off the bush. Now the Countess had all her clothes on again. With her long hand, she stroked her furs. The Count picked up the rose, bowed, and handed it to his wife. When she touched it, she dropped it. It bites, she said.
Okay, I'm back. Hopefully you can hear me. Hopefully you heard that. And that I think gives you kind of an interesting intro to what Angela Carter is up to in her stories, right? Just on the surface of things, we've got an interesting kind of reversal, subversion, transgression of what is supposed to be going on in the original. Here, Snow White is that little girl, but she's a figure of disruption in a marriage, right? She's a malign force. She's a dangerous force. The Snow White of the fairy tale is innocent, beautiful, and good. The Snow Child in Carter's version, a retelling of Snow White, is malign, is dangerous, is a temptation for the husband, which threatens to ruin a marriage. And here, the stepmother, the countess in the story, the woman married to the count, the countess, she is actually the figure of sympathy in the story. We get to see the story here as told from the perspective of the jealous mother who sees her husband attracted to a woman much younger and more attractive, which is actually what he wants. He says, I can't remember the exact words, so sorry, I've got it on my side here. He says, I wish I had a girl as white as snow. Bang. And then he does get one, right? But this is again something Carter's playing around with, is this intimation of violence. The girl is built, created from a hole filled with blood, right? We get something else that is pulled through from the original story is the colors. The story is called Snow White, and we have colors like snow. The red lips comes from the blood. Also, the in the classical drawings of Snow White, she's got this very, very black hair, and then there's a raven in this story which stands in for the black, and it's as though the snow child is created out of these three things: the blood, the snow, and the feathers. She's made. So it's a very kind of tactile, real world set of objects that create this desire into something real. And not only is she real, but she's also sexual. She's like naked when the Count sees her. So there's something going on there with kind of male desire and the male gaze as it sees women, which is again a threat to the Countess. Um, and then you've got what happens is that her husband is basically kind of giving himself over to this new female, and all the clothes from the Countess began to become stripped of her and get given to the Snow Child. So the Countess, the stepmother, is losing power. She's becoming the non-dominant kind of character. And we can see how much of a victimization actually that is of her, right? That it's unfair, it's unjust. She's a wife, she's a loyal wife, she loves her husband, but she's being punished for it by her husband's own fickleness and cruelty, and the fact that he has no ability to restrain himself. I want something and I will get it. And I will take things from you and give it to the thing that I want. So that in a way is a crisis for the Countess, for the stepmother. How is she suffering this very stereotypical story of the cheating husband? How is she going to assert herself? What must happen in order for the Countess to get back her husband? And what Carter says is not like just leave him or go find another husband or, cheat on somebody else to get him back. These are kind of easy ideas. Carter goes for something way more difficult and, in a way, very offensive and gross, which is that she lets her husband. Well, first of all, she kind of organizes it so that the snow child dies. She picks a rose, pricks her fingers on the thorn, bleeds, screams, and falls. So she dies, in essence. Weeping, the Count got off his horse. And then, basically, in a move typical of Angela Carter, she gives us a bit of necrophilia. So how's that for a Wednesday evening, and the Count basically has his way with this dead girl. But the Countess lets him. The Countess reined in, it says here, the Countess reined in her stamping mare and watched him narrowly. He was soon finished. Then the girl began to melt. Soon there was nothing left of her but a feather a bird might have dropped, a blood stain like the trace of a fox's kill on the snow, and the rose she had pulled off the bush. Now the Countess had all her clothes on again. With her long hand she stroked her furs. So she's back in position. She's the main wife now. She's back in the strong, dominant position. The Count picked up the rose, bowed, and handed it to his wife. Okay, so now the Count actually is in a more subservient role. In the beginning of the story, he was the chief, the boss. He was going riding with his wife. He wanted something and he got it. At the end, he is bowing to his wife and handing her a rose. When she touched it, she dropped it. So she's not going to fall for the rose trick. It bites, she said. So she is the one who kind of has the wisdom now. She's in the better, stronger position. But what she's had to do is kind of allow her husband to give in to his weak and worst impulses. And because she loves her husband, she lets him do that. And once he's done it, he's kind of revealed himself for what he truly is. And what he truly is a weak person. He's weak for wanting what he wanted, and he's weak and bad for doing what he did. And so she ends up being the one who's, in a way, better. She's literally above him. She's on a horse, he's on the land, on the ground, in this new equation at the end of it. So you can see that, like, not only is Carter, in a sense, retold the Snow White story, she's actually totally changed the meaning of it. She's given us a whole different way to understand the way how female characters behave, what their options are, what they can do in life, and then suggesting to you that the same is true for you, right? That female male relations, we get told they need to work in a certain way. Actually, they do not. There's a surprising other way they can work as well, and in a way that is often beneficial to the woman. That's just one reading that's possible in that story. You'll notice there that it's short, that it's very suggestive, it's metaphorical. There's a lot of ways you can interpret that story. What I've given you is just a kind of possible understanding of it. Just because I have said it doesn't mean that I'm correct. It's just a take. You can read that story 1,000 different ways, and that's the power also of Angela Carter, is that she's very indirect and suggestive. Remember, she's working with latent materials, so her work is indirect. It She shows you a lot of things and never really tells you what it is that you're supposed to think about the things she has revealed. It's up to you to take it on, to think about it, to work with it, and to arrive at some sort of an understanding of what it was that you've just read. That's why her work is so interesting. It's because it's so suggestive of possible interpretations. Okay, hopefully that makes some kind of sense. A reminder, just as I go back, as we wrap up now, um, that these are the 6 prescribed stories. You don't have to read the whole book, just these 6, and the 3 we will cover in some form or another will be Snow Child, as we just did, A Company of Wolves, which I'll do in a recording, and then probably our last live class for LU2 will be about The Bloody Chamber. Well, it's a long one, so it will have to be something I race through quite quickly. Okay, so enjoy that reading. Like I say, the books are pretty gross, as you've just seen, a bit of necrophilia. It gets weirder and worse than that, believe me, especially The Company of Wolves. So like I said, just take it on board in the spirit that it's intended, a spirit of inquiry and exploration. Angela Carter is not the final word on how life should work, but it's certainly a very interesting and provocative perspective. I'm going to stay online here for another 2 minutes or so, just in case you guys have any questions or queries about whatever it is, ICE tasks, assignment. I'm going to stay online here, but otherwise we are done for the evening for this fortnight. And I wish you a very good rest of your evening, wherever you are and whatever you're doing. Stay on top of your work. If you run into problems with your assignment with part 1, let me know and I'll get back to you as quickly as I can. Look out for my next recording. Look out for my next recording, and it'll cover probably for over about 5 or 10 minutes what you can do in your assignment. Okay. Cheers, everyone. Have a good evening.